What happens when someone with power refuses to stay silent in the face of corruption? Today's story will shake you to your core. Picture this: a packed federal courtroom, cameras rolling, and one woman who discovers something so shocking about a sitting judge that when she reveals it, the entire room erupts in chaos. This isn't just about legal procedures or political maneuvering. This is about justice, family legacy, and how one moment of courage can expose decades of hidden truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Federal District Courthouse in downtown Chicago. Attorney General Maria Santos adjusted her briefcase as she walked through the towering doors, her heels clicking against the polished floor with the steady rhythm of someone who had walked these halls countless times before. Today felt different, though. The weight of what she was about to present in court pressed against her chest like a stone. Maria had built her career on meticulous preparation and unwavering dedication to justice. As the youngest attorney general in the state's history, she had prosecuted some of the most complex corruption cases in recent memory. Her reputation for thoroughness was legendary among both colleagues and adversaries. She never entered a courtroom unless she was absolutely certain of her facts, and today would be no exception. The case before Judge Robert Harrison was supposed to be routine, a fraud investigation involving a construction company that had allegedly overcharged the city for public works projects. The defendant, Webb Construction, had been accused of inflating costs by millions of dollars over a 5-year period. It was the kind of white-collar crime that rarely made headlines, but represented exactly the type of systematic corruption that Maria had dedicated her career to fighting. Judge Harrison had been presiding over cases in this district for nearly 20 years. He was known for his stern demeanor, sharp legal mind, and reputation for running an efficient courtroom. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him the appearance of someone who had seen every possible legal argument and wasn't easily impressed. Most attorneys respected him, though some found his methods intimidating. Maria had appeared before him dozens of times and had always found their interactions professional, if not particularly warm. As Maria settled into her seat at the prosecutor's table, she noticed the defendant's legal team was unusually confident. Webb himself, a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning hair and expensive suits, sat with his attorneys wearing an expression that seemed almost smug. His lead counsel, Jennifer Parks, was known for her aggressive defense tactics and had a reputation for finding technicalities that could derail even the strongest cases. The courtroom began to fill with the usual mix of legal professionals, court reporters, and a handful of journalists who covered the local corruption beat. Maria's assistant prosecutor, David Chen, leaned over and whispered, "Everything's ready. The financial documents are ironclad, and our witnesses are solid. This should be straightforward." Maria nodded, but something nagged at her. Over the weekend, while reviewing the case files one final time, she had noticed several procedural decisions that Judge Harrison had made during pre-trial motions that seemed unusually favorable to the defense. Individually, each ruling could be explained as standard judicial discretion, but collectively they formed a pattern that troubled her legal instincts. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with his characteristic brisk efficiency, and everyone rose as the bailiff called the session to order. As the judge settled into his chair and began reviewing his notes, Maria studied his face, looking for any tells or hints about his state of mind. What she saw surprised her: a slight tension around his eyes, a barely perceptible tightness in his jaw that suggested he might be more stressed about this case than his calm exterior indicated. The opening statements proceeded as expected. Maria presented a clear, methodical case outlining how Webb Construction had systematically overcharged the city through inflated material costs, phantom labor charges, and kickbacks to city officials. Her presentation was backed by financial records, witness testimony, and a paper trail that painted a picture of deliberate fraud spanning multiple construction projects. Jennifer Parks countered with a defense that focused on the complexity of construction accounting and suggested that any discrepancies were the result of legitimate cost overruns and poor city oversight rather than intentional fraud. Her argument was skillfully crafted to create reasonable doubt, but Maria felt confident that the evidence was strong enough to overcome these defenses. What happened next, however, began to shift Maria's confidence. Judge Harrison sustained several objections from the defense that Maria felt were questionable. When she attempted to introduce key financial documents that clearly showed the pattern of overcharging, the judge ruled them inadmissible based on what seemed like an overly technical interpretation of evidence rules. When her star witness, a former Webb employee who had blown the whistle on the fraudulent practices, began his testimony, Judge Harrison allowed the defense to interrupt with objections so frequently that the witness's story became fragmented and less compelling. During the lunch recess, Maria found herself pacing in the courthouse cafeteria, her usual calm demeanor replaced by growing frustration. David Chen joined her at a corner table, his expression mirroring her concern. "Something's not right here," David said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Those evidentiary rulings are way outside normal parameters. And the way he's allowing Parks to control the witness testimony, I've never seen Harrison operate like this." Maria stirred her coffee absently, her mind racing through possibilities. "I've been thinking the same thing. It's not just one or two questionable calls. It's a pattern. And patterns don't usually emerge by accident in a courtroom." "What are you thinking?" David asked, lowering his voice even further. "I'm thinking we might need to look more carefully at the relationships between the parties." "In this case," Maria replied, "Harrison's been on the bench for 2 decades. Webb Construction has been operating in this city for about the same period. That's a lot of time for connections to develop." After lunch, the afternoon session continued with the same troubling pattern. Expert witnesses for the prosecution found their testimony limited by narrow scope rulings from the judge, while defense experts were given considerably more latitude to present their arguments. Maria began taking detailed notes, not just on the testimony, but on each judicial ruling, building a record of what increasingly appeared to be systematic bias. The breakthrough came during a brief recess when Maria was gathering her papers. A manila folder slipped from her briefcase and scattered documents across the floor. As she knelt to collect them, she noticed that one document, a subpoenaed financial record from Webb Construction, had landed partially under the defense table. As she reached for it, she noticed something that made her freeze. Protruding slightly from Jennifer Parks's briefcase was a document with a letterhead she recognized: Harrison Holdings, LLC. Maria knew that name because her team had researched all of Marcus Webb's business relationships as part of their investigation. Harrison Holdings was listed as a consulting firm that had received payments from Webb Construction over the past 3 years, but they had been unable to determine the exact nature of the consulting services provided. Maria's mind raced as she processed this information. Harrison Holdings and Judge Robert Harrison sharing a name could be a coincidence, but in her experience, coincidences in corruption cases were rare. She carefully retrieved her document and returned to her seat, her heart pounding as she considered the implications of what she might have discovered. That evening, Maria worked late in her office, using every legal database and public record search available to investigate Harrison Holdings, LLC. What she found sent chills down her spine. The company had been incorporated 15 years earlier, with Robert Harrison listed as the principal owner. The business had been relatively inactive for most of its existence, showing minimal revenue and expenses until 3 years ago, when it suddenly began receiving regular payments from Webb Construction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The payments weren't enormous, typically between $5,000 and $15,000 per month, but they were consistent and had totaled nearly $200,000 over the 3-year period. The stated purpose was consulting services, but Maria could find no evidence of any actual consulting work being performed. No reports, no meetings, no deliverables, just regular payments from a construction company to a judge's private business. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she printed out the financial records. If her suspicions were correct, she was looking at evidence of judicial corruption that went far beyond simple bias. This was bribery. A sitting federal judge had been receiving regular payments from a defendant who was now appearing before him in court. The ethical implications were staggering. Every case that Judge Harrison had overseen involving Webb Construction or its associates would now be suspect. Every ruling, every sentence, every legal decision could have been influenced by financial incentives rather than legal merit. The integrity of the entire judicial system in this district could be compromised. But Maria also knew that making such an accusation against a sitting federal judge was extraordinarily serious. She would need ironclad evidence and a clear strategy for how to proceed. Accusations of judicial corruption couldn't be made lightly, or without absolute certainty of the facts. She spent the rest of the night building a comprehensive timeline. The payments from Webb Construction to Harrison Holdings had begun just 2 months before Judge Harrison was assigned to his first case involving Webb Construction. A relatively minor dispute over a city contract that the judge had ruled in Webb's favor. Over the following 3 years, Harrison had presided over 6 different cases involving Webb Construction or its subsidiaries, ruling in the company's favor in all 6 instances. The pattern was undeniable. The timing was suspicious. The financial relationship was clearly documented. But Maria knew that proving corruption required more than just showing financial transactions. She needed to demonstrate that the payments were made with the intent to influence judicial decisions and that the judge had knowingly accepted bribes in exchange for favorable rulings. As dawn broke over the city, Maria sat in her office surrounded by documents, legal precedents, and case files. She had spent the entire night researching, but she had also been wrestling with a deeper question about her own motivations and responsibilities. Maria's father, Carlos Santos, had been a civil rights attorney who had spent his career fighting for justice in cases that others had deemed hopeless. He had taught her that the law was only as strong as the courage of those who enforced it, and that sometimes doing the right thing required taking risks that went beyond personal comfort or career advancement. Carlos had died 5 years earlier, but his voice seemed to echo in Maria's mind as she contemplated the decision before her. She could proceed with the Webb Construction case as planned, knowing that the deck was stacked against her, but hoping that the strength of her evidence might still result in a conviction. It would be the safe choice, the one that wouldn't jeopardize her career or reputation. Or she could take the far more dangerous path of exposing what she believed to be judicial corruption, knowing that such an accusation would either make her a hero or destroy her career entirely. Maria thought about all the other defendants who had faced Judge Harrison over the past 3 years, particularly those who had been convicted and sentenced by a judge who might have been compromised. She thought about the public trust in the judicial system and what it meant when that trust was betrayed by those sworn to uphold it. By the time the sun was fully up, Maria had made her decision. She would expose the corruption, but she would do it in a way that was legally sound and professionally responsible. She would present her evidence in open court, where it would become part of the public record and where Judge Harrison would have the opportunity to respond to the allegations. The next morning, as Maria prepared to return to court, she called David Chen and asked him to meet her early. When he arrived at her office, he found her surrounded by boxes of additional evidence and legal briefs that she had prepared overnight. "We're changing strategy," Maria announced without preamble. "I've discovered something about this case that changes everything." David looked at the scattered documents and the determination in Maria's eyes. "What kind of something?" "The kind that could send a federal judge to prison," Maria replied. "But first, I need you to help me verify every single piece of evidence I've gathered. We're going to get one chance to present this, and we can't afford any mistakes." Over the next few hours, Maria walked David through her discoveries. His reactions ranged from shock to disbelief to growing anger as the full scope of the apparent corruption became clear. "Maria, you realize what you're talking about here," David said finally. "Accusing a sitting federal judge of bribery in open court? Even if you're right, even if you have solid evidence, this could end your career. Harrison has connections throughout the federal judiciary. Parks has connections throughout the legal community. Webb Construction has connections throughout the business and political establishment." "I know," Maria replied calmly, "but my father taught me that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. And right now I can't think of anything more important than making sure that justice actually happens in that courtroom today." David studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to help me prepare a motion to recuse Judge Harrison from this case based on undisclosed financial conflicts of interest. And I need you to help me organize this evidence so that when I present it, it's absolutely clear and undeniable." They spent the morning preparing what would become one of the most explosive court filings in the district's history. Maria knew that once she filed the motion and presented her evidence, there would be no going back. Judge Harrison would either be vindicated or destroyed, and her own career would either be made or ended. As they walked toward the courthouse for the afternoon session, Maria felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this, moments when the law demanded courage rather than comfort, when justice required someone to step forward regardless of the personal cost. The courtroom was packed with the usual mix of attorneys, journalists, and court watchers. Judge Harrison took his seat with his characteristic efficiency, apparently unaware that his entire career was about to be called into question. "Your Honor," Maria said, rising from her seat as the session began. "Before we proceed with today's testimony, I have a motion to present to the court." Judge Harrison looked up from his notes, a slight frown crossing his features. "What kind of motion, Counselor?" "A motion for recusal based on undisclosed financial conflicts of interest that have come to my attention during the course of this case." The courtroom fell silent. Jennifer Parks looked up sharply from her notes, her face registering surprise and concern. Marcus Webb leaned forward in his chair, his confident expression beginning to waver. Judge Harrison's face remained impassive, but Maria noticed that his knuckles had gone white as he gripped his gavel. "That's a very serious allegation, Ms. Santos. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such a motion." "I do, Your Honor," Maria replied, her voice steady and clear. "And I believe the court and the public have a right to hear that evidence." What happened next would be remembered as one of the most dramatic moments in the courthouse's long history. Maria began to present her evidence methodically and carefully, building a case that was as compelling as it was devastating. With each financial document, each piece of evidence, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew more tense. Judge Harrison listened with growing shock and anger, his judicial composure beginning to crack as the full scope of Maria's allegations became clear. Jennifer Parks objected repeatedly, but her objections sounded increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted. And somewhere in the gallery, an elderly man named Thomas Rivera sat watching the proceedings with growing amazement. Thomas had been following corruption cases for years, ever since his own son had been wrongfully convicted by a judge who had later been found to be taking bribes. His son had died in prison before his name could be cleared, and Thomas had spent the last decade advocating for judicial reform and transparency. What Thomas didn't know, and what Maria was about to discover, was that her father, Carlos Santos, had been the attorney who had fought unsuccessfully to appeal his son's conviction 15 years earlier. Carlos had believed in the young man's innocence, but had been unable to overcome what they now knew had been a corrupted system. The hidden connection between Maria and Thomas was about to create a moment that would transform not just this courtroom, but the entire conversation about justice and accountability in the federal court system. As Maria continued her presentation, building toward the revelation that would change everything, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. This was no longer just about one construction company or one corrupt judge. This was about the fundamental integrity of the justice system itself. And Maria Santos, driven by her father's legacy and her own unwavering commitment to justice, was about to prove that sometimes one person with courage and evidence can indeed change everything. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Maria Santos continued laying out her evidence. Each financial document she presented painted a clearer picture of what appeared to be systematic corruption. Judge Harrison's face had grown increasingly pale, though he maintained his judicial composure behind the bench. The gallery had swelled with additional spectators who had somehow learned that something extraordinary was happening in courtroom 7B. "Your Honor," Maria continued, her voice unwavering despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "These records show that Harrison Holdings LLC received payments totaling $197,000 from Webb Construction over a 36-month period. The timing of these payments directly correlates with cases involving Webb Construction that came before this court." Jennifer Parks shot to her feet, her usually controlled demeanor showing cracks of desperation. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a transparent attempt to derail legitimate proceedings with unsubstantiated accusations. Ms. Santos is clearly grasping at straws because she knows her case against my client is weak." Judge Harrison's gavel hand trembled slightly as he looked from Parks to Maria. For the first time in his 20-year career, he seemed uncertain about how to proceed. The protocols for this situation weren't covered in any judicial handbook he had ever studied. "Ms. Santos," Judge Harrison said slowly, his voice strained, "these are extremely serious allegations you're making. I need to understand exactly what you're suggesting." Maria took a deep breath. This was the moment that would define not just this case, but potentially her entire career. "Your Honor, I'm suggesting that the financial relationship between your private business and the defendant in this case creates an insurmountable conflict of interest that should have been disclosed to all parties. I'm further suggesting that this relationship may have influenced judicial decisions in ways that compromise the integrity of these proceedings." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Court reporters typed frantically, trying to capture every word of what was clearly becoming a historic moment. In the gallery, Thomas Rivera leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the bench in front of him. Something about this young prosecutor's courage reminded him of another lawyer from long ago. someone who had fought just as passionately for justice in a case that had personal meaning to Thomas. David Chen, sitting beside Maria at the prosecutor's table, watched the proceedings with a mixture of admiration and terror. He had worked with Maria for 3 years and had never seen her take such an enormous professional risk. But he also knew that her commitment to justice was absolute, inherited from a father who had instilled in her the belief that the law meant nothing if those who enforced it could be bought. Judge Harrison set down his gavel and rubbed his temples. The weight of 2 decades on the bench suddenly felt crushing. "Ms. Santos, I need to recess this court while I review these documents you've presented. This is an unprecedented situation." "Your Honor," Maria replied firmly, "with respect, I believe the public nature of these proceedings is essential. The integrity of our judicial system depends on transparency, especially when questions of corruption are raised." Marcus Webb, who had been growing more agitated throughout Maria's presentation, suddenly stood up, despite his attorney's attempts to restrain him. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "Harrison Holdings provides legitimate consulting services. We've done nothing wrong." The outburst sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Jennifer Parks immediately began trying to quiet her client, but the damage was done. Webb had essentially confirmed the business relationship that Judge Harrison had never disclosed. "Mr. Webb," Judge Harrison said sharply, "you will sit down and remain silent, or you will be held in contempt." But Webb was beyond rational thought. Now, the careful facade he had maintained throughout the trial was crumbling. "You don't understand. We had agreements, we had understandings." "Marcus, stop talking," Jennifer Parks hissed, but her client was in full meltdown mode. "Those consulting fees were legitimate," Webb continued, his voice rising. "We needed guidance on regulatory compliance, and Harrison Holdings provided valuable insights into federal contracting requirements." The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Webb's words sank in. He had just admitted in open court that his company had been paying the judge's private business for insights into federal contracting requirements. Even if the services had been legitimate, which seemed highly unlikely, the failure to disclose this relationship was a serious ethical violation. Judge Harrison's face had gone from pale to ashen. He realized that his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom were now hanging by a thread. The careful arrangements that had seemed so reasonable in private meetings now appeared sordid and corrupt under the harsh light of public scrutiny. Maria felt her heart racing, but her training took over. This was the moment she had been preparing, for without realizing it, all the late nights studying case law, all the mock trials, all the preparation that had led to her becoming the youngest attorney general in state history had been building toward this confrontation with corruption at the highest levels. "Your Honor," Maria said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "I move for an immediate investigation into this matter by the Judicial Ethics Committee. Additionally, I request that all cases involving Webb Construction that have come before this court in the past 5 years be reviewed for potential judicial misconduct." The request sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. Maria wasn't just asking for Judge Harrison to recuse himself from this case. She was calling for a comprehensive investigation that could overturn dozens of previous rulings and potentially send a federal judge to prison. Jennifer Parks was now frantically whispering to Marcus Webb, trying to limit the damage from his outburst. But the cat was out of the bag, and there was no putting it back. The business relationship between Webb Construction and Harrison Holdings was now a matter of public record, along with Webb's admission that they had been paying for insights into federal contracting. In the gallery, Thomas Rivera felt his pulse quicken. The courage this young prosecutor was showing reminded him powerfully of another lawyer who had fought against corruption decades earlier. That lawyer had ultimately been unsuccessful, but not for lack of trying. Thomas remembered how that attorney had told him that sometimes the most important battles were the ones that seemed impossible to win because they established precedents for future fights. That lawyer's name had been Carlos Santos, and he had represented Thomas's son Miguel in an appeal of a conviction that everyone involved had known was the result of a corrupt judge taking bribes. Carlos had fought tirelessly, but the system had been too entrenched, the corruption too well protected. Miguel had died in prison 3 years later, still maintaining his innocence, still believing that justice would eventually prevail. Thomas had never forgotten Carlos Santos or the passion with which he had fought for Miguel's freedom. In the years since his son's death, Thomas had become an advocate for judicial reform, attending trials and monitoring proceedings to ensure that other families didn't suffer the way his had. He had dedicated his retirement to being a watchdog for judicial integrity, though he had never expected to witness anything quite like what was unfolding before him now. As Thomas watched Maria Santos methodically dismantle what appeared to be a web of judicial corruption, he began to notice something familiar about her demeanor, her passion, her unwavering commitment to justice despite obvious personal and professional risks. The resemblance wasn't physical, but there was something in her approach that reminded him strongly of Carlos Santos. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, though it was clear that he was stalling for time while trying to figure out how to handle a situation that threatened to destroy everything he had built over 2 decades on the bench. As the courtroom began to empty, Thomas Rivera made his way toward the prosecutor's table where Maria was gathering her documents. "Excuse me, Ms. Santos," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his years and his grief. "I wanted to thank you for what you're doing here today." Maria looked up, surprised by the interruption, but recognizing something in the elderly man's eyes that suggested his thanks carried deeper meaning than simple civic appreciation. "I'm just doing my job, sir," Maria replied, though she was touched by the sincerity in his voice. "No," Thomas said, shaking his head slowly, "what you're doing goes beyond any job description. I've been watching judicial proceedings for 15 years, ever since my son was wrongfully convicted by a corrupt judge. I've seen too many prosecutors who were willing to work within a broken system rather than challenge it." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about this man's story that resonated with her on a level she couldn't quite identify. "I'm sorry about your son," she said softly. "His name was Miguel Rivera," Thomas continued. "He was convicted of financial crimes he didn't commit, sent to prison by a judge who was later found to be taking bribes from the very companies Miguel was accused of defrauding. By the time the corruption was exposed, it was too late for Miguel. He died in prison, still fighting to clear his name." The name Miguel Rivera struck Maria like a physical blow. She had heard that name before, spoken with reverence and sadness in her father's voice during late-night conversations about cases that had haunted him throughout his career. Carlos Santos had often talked about the clients he felt he had failed, and Miguel Rivera was a name that had come up repeatedly. "Mr. Rivera," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper, "was your son's attorney Carlos Santos?" Thomas's eyes widened in shock. "Yes. How could you possibly know that?" Maria felt the world shifting around her as the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. "Carlos Santos was my father." The silence that followed was profound. Two people who had never met before, brought together by chance in a courtroom where justice was being fought for once again, suddenly realized they were connected by a tragedy that had shaped both their lives in fundamental ways. "Your father," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the most dedicated lawyer I ever met. He fought for Miguel when everyone else had given up. He believed in my son's innocence when the entire system was arrayed against us. Maria felt tears threatening to well up in her eyes as she thought about the countless hours her father had spent on the Rivera case, the phone calls late at night, the frustration in his voice when appeals were denied, the profound sadness when he learned of Miguel's death in prison. "He never stopped talking about your son," Maria said. Even years later, he would bring up the case. He felt like he had failed Miguel, failed you, failed the system itself. "He didn't fail," Thomas said firmly. "He was fighting against corruption that was too deeply entrenched for any one person to overcome. But he planted seeds, Ms. Santos. He showed me and others that there were still people in the system who cared about justice more than their careers." David Chen, who had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, began to understand the deeper significance of what was happening. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge or one fraudulent construction company. This was about a legacy of fighting for justice that had been passed from father to daughter, about the long arc of moral courage that sometimes spans generations. "Mr. Rivera," Maria said, her voice growing stronger as she processed this revelation, "would you be willing to testify about your son's case? About what happened when corruption in the judicial system goes unchecked?" Thomas straightened his shoulders, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away from his face. "I've been waiting 15 years for someone to ask me that question." As court was called back into session, the dynamic in the courtroom had shifted in ways that weren't immediately apparent to most observers. Maria Santos was no longer just a prosecutor doing her job. She was carrying forward a mission that her father had started but been unable to complete. Thomas Rivera was no longer just a grieving father. He was a witness to the human cost of judicial corruption who finally had the chance to make his voice heard. Judge Harrison returned to the bench, looking haggard and uncertain. The recess had clearly not provided him with any easy solutions to the crisis that was engulfing his courtroom and his career. "Ms. Santos," Judge Harrison said, his voice lacking its usual authority, "I've reviewed the documents you've presented. While the financial relationships you've outlined are concerning, I'm not prepared to concede that they constitute the kind of corruption you're alleging." Maria stood, and Thomas Rivera could see in her posture the same determination that her father had shown decades earlier. "Your Honor, I have additional evidence that I believe will clarify the nature of these financial relationships." What Maria presented next was the result of her overnight investigation into Harrison Holdings LLC. She had discovered that the company had no employees other than Judge Harrison himself, no office other than a post office box, and no business activities other than receiving payments from Webb Construction. The consulting services that Marcus Webb had referenced were completely undocumented, with no contracts, no deliverables, and no record of any actual work being performed. These payments, Maria explained to the increasingly stunned courtroom, were not for legitimate consulting services. They were regular, undocumented cash transfers from a defendant to a judge who would later preside over multiple cases involving that defendant. Jennifer Parks made several desperate attempts to object, but Judge Harrison was no longer sustaining her objections with his usual confidence. The evidence Maria was presenting was methodical, comprehensive, and devastating. Furthermore, Maria continued, "I've discovered that Webb Construction has been involved in 47 different legal proceedings over the past 5 years. Of those proceedings, 31 took place in jurisdictions outside this district, where Judge Harrison had no involvement. In those 31 cases, Webb Construction lost 26 times, a success rate of approximately 16%. The courtroom was completely silent as the implications of this statistic became clear. However, Maria continued, in the 16 cases that took place in this district under Judge Harrison's jurisdiction, Webb Construction won 15 times, a success rate of 94%. The statistical probability of such a dramatic difference occurring by chance is less than 1 in 10,000. The mathematical precision of Maria's argument was overwhelming. Even if individual rulings could be explained away, the pattern was undeniable. Webb Construction had enjoyed unprecedented success only in cases presided over by Judge Harrison, and only during the period when Harrison Holdings LLC was receiving regular payments from the company. Marcus Webb was now slumped in his chair, his earlier bravado completely gone. Jennifer Parks had stopped trying to object, apparently recognizing that her client's situation had become hopeless. The case that had started as a routine fraud prosecution had become an exposé of systematic judicial corruption. "Your Honor," Maria said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority, "this is not just about one judge or one defendant. This is about the integrity of our entire judicial system. When judges can be bought, when justice can be purchased, when the scales of justice tip toward whoever is willing to pay the highest price, then we have lost the very foundation of our democracy." In the gallery, Thomas Rivera felt a surge of pride and hope that he hadn't experienced in 15 years. This young woman, the daughter of the lawyer who had fought so hard for his son, was finally speaking the words that needed to be spoken, finally shining light on the corruption that had cost Miguel his life and his freedom. Judge Harrison sat behind the bench, his 20-year career crumbling around him in real time. The careful rationalization he had constructed around his relationship with Webb Construction was dissolving under the harsh scrutiny of public examination. What had seemed like harmless supplemental income for harmless consulting work now appeared exactly as corrupt as Maria Santos was alleging. "Ms. Santos," Judge Harrison said finally, his voice barely audible, "what exactly are you asking this court to do?" "I'm asking you to recuse yourself from this case immediately," Maria replied. "I'm asking for all previous cases involving Webb Construction to be reviewed by an independent panel. I'm asking for a full investigation by the Judicial Ethics Committee and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I'm asking that this courtroom, this moment, serve as a reminder that no one, regardless of their position or power, is above the law." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of slow, deliberate clapping from the gallery. Thomas Rivera had begun to applaud, his weathered hands coming together with the measured rhythm of someone who had waited a very long time to see justice triumph over corruption. One by one, other spectators joined in the applause. Court reporters, bailiffs, attorneys who had been observing the proceedings, and citizens who had come to witness what they sensed was a historic moment all began clapping. The sound grew and swelled until it filled the entire courtroom. Judge Harrison looked out at the sea of faces, many of them showing expressions of disappointment and betrayal, others showing hope and vindication. In that moment, he understood that his career as a federal judge was over, but perhaps more importantly, he understood that the system itself was being renewed by the courage of one prosecutor who had refused to accept corruption as inevitable. Maria Santos stood in the center of the storm she had created, feeling the weight of her father's legacy and the responsibility of the moment. She had exposed corruption at the highest levels of the judiciary, but she had also demonstrated that the system could still work when people of conscience were willing to risk everything for the sake of justice. The revelation of her connection to Thomas Rivera had transformed this from a professional duty into a personal mission. She was not just prosecuting a case. She was completing work that her father had started, honoring the memory of Miguel Rivera, and proving that sometimes justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. As the applause continued to echo through the courtroom, Maria knew that this moment would define the rest of her career. She had chosen courage over comfort, justice over job security, and truth over expedience. The ripple effects of this decision would extend far beyond this courtroom, this case, or even this city. Judge Harrison slowly removed his judicial robes, folded them carefully and placed them on the bench. In that simple act, he acknowledged what everyone in the courtroom already knew. His time as a judge was over, but the pursuit of justice would continue. The sound of applause gradually faded as the magnitude of what had just occurred began to settle over everyone in the courtroom. Judge Harrison's removal of his judicial robes had been more than a symbolic gesture. It was an admission that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Federal Courthouse, which had operated under a shadow of corruption for years, was about to undergo a transformation that would reverberate through the entire legal system. Maria Santos remained standing at the prosecutor's table, her heart still racing from the adrenaline of the confrontation, but her mind already moving toward the enormous task ahead. Exposing the corruption had been only the first step. Now came the more complex challenge of rebuilding trust in a system that had been fundamentally compromised. David Chen approached her with a mixture of awe and concern etched across his face. "Maria, do you realize what you've just set in motion? This isn't going to end with Harrison and Webb. This is going to trigger investigations into every case, every ruling, every decision that's been made in this district for years." Maria nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "I know, and that's exactly what needs to happen. We can't have justice for some people, but not others. We can't have a system where your access to fair treatment depends on whether you can afford to pay bribes to judges." Thomas Rivera made his way through the crowd that was slowly dispersing from the gallery. His eyes were bright with an emotion he hadn't felt in 15 years. Hope. Not hope for his son, who was beyond the reach of earthly justice, but hope that the system that had failed Miguel might finally be reformed. "Ms. Santos," Thomas said, as he approached, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know what this means to me, to families like mine. My son died believing that someday someone would have the courage to expose the truth. Today, you proved he was right." Maria felt tears threatening to well up in her eyes as she grasped the full significance of the moment. She wasn't just a prosecutor who had uncovered corruption. She was the completion of a circle that had begun with her father's unsuccessful fight for Miguel Rivera. The legacy of that fight, the seeds of justice that Carlos Santos had planted even in defeat, had finally borne fruit. "Mr. Rivera," Maria said, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt, "would you be willing to work with me on what comes next? This can't be just about punishment for those who did wrong. It has to be about making sure this never happens again." Thomas straightened his shoulders, and in that moment, Maria could see the man he had been before grief and injustice had bent him. "I've been waiting 15 years for someone to ask me that question. Whatever you need, whatever you're planning, count me in." The courtroom was now nearly empty except for the key players in the drama that had just unfolded. Jennifer Parks was huddled with Marcus Webb in urgent conversation, undoubtedly trying to assess the damage and plan their next moves. Court security was standing by, uncertain about proper protocol for a situation where a federal judge had essentially admitted to corruption in open court. The chief bailiff, a 20-year veteran named Raymond Torres, approached Maria with a concerned expression. "Miss Santos, we need guidance on how to proceed. Judge Harrison has left the building, but there are still legal procedures that need to be followed. Who has jurisdiction over this case now?" Maria realized that the administrative chaos created by Harrison's impromptu resignation was almost as significant as the corruption itself. Dozens of pending cases would need to be reassigned, and every decision Harrison had made over the past several years would need to be reviewed for potential bias or corruption. "I'll need to contact the chief judge for this district immediately," Maria replied, "This case will need to be transferred to another jurisdiction to ensure complete impartiality, and we'll need to establish a special review committee to examine all of Judge Harrison's previous rulings." David Chen was already on his phone, making the necessary calls to set the administrative machinery in motion. The exposure of judicial corruption required not just moral courage, but also careful legal and procedural navigation to ensure that justice was served without creating chaos in the court system. As Maria gathered her documents and prepared to leave the courtroom, she noticed that several reporters had gathered in the hallway outside. Word of what had happened was already spreading, and she knew that by evening, the story would be national news. The exposure of a federal judge taking bribes was significant enough, but the dramatic way it had been revealed in open court would make it the kind of story that captured public attention and demanded accountability. Sarah Mitchell, a veteran, courthouse reporter for the Chicago Tribune, intercepted Maria as she left the courtroom. "Ms. Santos, can you comment on what just happened in there? Are you alleging that Judge Harrison was taking bribes from Marcus Webb?" Maria paused, knowing that her next words would be scrutinized and analyzed by legal experts, politicians, and the general public. "What I presented today was evidence of financial relationships that should have been disclosed and weren't. The facts speak for themselves, and I trust that the appropriate authorities will investigate thoroughly and hold everyone accountable." "But do you believe justice was served today?" Sarah pressed. Maria thought for a moment before responding. "Justice isn't just about punishment for wrongdoing. It's about creating a system where everyone, regardless of their wealth or connections, can expect fair treatment under the law. Today was an important step toward that goal, but it's only the beginning." Thomas Rivera, who had been listening to the exchange, stepped forward. "If I may add something," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had suffered personally from judicial corruption. "What Ms. Santos did today took extraordinary courage. She risked her career to expose a system that was failing. People like my son, that's not just good lawyering, that's heroism." The reporter's eyes lit up as she recognized the potential for a deeper human interest story. "And you are?" "Thomas Rivera. My son Miguel was wrongfully convicted 15 years ago by a corrupt judge. Ms. Santos's father, Carlos Santos, represented Miguel in his appeal. Today, she finished the work her father started." Sarah Mitchell's expression shifted as she realized the profound personal dimensions of the story she was covering. This wasn't just about legal procedures and ethical violations. It was about families destroyed by corruption and the long journey toward justice that sometimes spans generations. "Would you be willing to tell me more about your son's case?" Sarah asked Thomas. "I'll tell you everything," Thomas replied firmly. "Miguel's story needs to be told. People need to understand what happens when the system fails, when judges can be bought, when justice becomes a commodity that only the wealthy can afford." As the small group made their way out of the courthouse, Maria felt a profound sense of responsibility settling over her. The exposure of Judge Harrison's corruption was just the beginning of what would need to be a comprehensive reform of the judicial system. There would be investigations, hearings, trials, and appeals. There would be political pressure from those who wanted to minimize the scandal and resistance from those who benefited from the status quo. But there would also be support from unexpected quarters. That evening, as Maria sat in her office preparing for the media storm she knew was coming, she received a phone call that surprised her. "Ms. Santos, this is Judge Patricia Hawkins from the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. I wanted to call personally to commend you for your courage today." Judge Hawkins was known throughout the legal community as one of the most respected and principled jurists in the federal system. Her support would carry enormous weight in the battles ahead. "Thank you, Your Honor," Maria replied. "I hope what happened today doesn't reflect badly on the judiciary as a whole." "On the contrary," Judge Hawkins said firmly, "what you did today reminded everyone why we have prosecutors and why the adversarial system works when people have the courage to use it properly. You've done a service not just to your community, but to the entire legal profession." Over the following days, the story of Maria's courtroom revelation dominated news cycles across the country. Legal experts debated the implications for judicial independence and accountability. Politicians called for investigations and reforms. Bar associations issued statements condemning judicial corruption while praising Maria's courage in exposing it. But the most meaningful response came from ordinary citizens who reached out to share their own stories of encounters with what they suspected was judicial bias or corruption. Maria's office was flooded with calls and emails from people who had felt powerless in the face of a system that seemed stacked against them. One letter particularly moved Maria. It came from a woman named Elena Vasquez, whose husband had been sentenced to an unusually harsh prison term by Judge Harrison for a non-violent drug offense. Elena had always suspected that her husband's lengthy sentence was the result of bias or corruption, but she had lacked the resources to challenge it effectively. "Ms. Santos," Elena wrote, "what you did gives me hope that my husband might finally get the fair hearing he deserved. He's been in prison for 4 years for a crime that usually results in probation or community service. I always wondered why. Judge Harrison was so harsh with him, especially since we couldn't afford the kind of expensive lawyers that other defendants had." Maria realized that Eleanor's letter represented dozens, possibly hundreds of similar cases. People who had been sentenced harshly, ruled against unfairly, or denied justice because they couldn't afford to pay the informal fees that Judge Harrison had been collecting through his consulting arrangement with Webb Construction. She immediately assigned David Chen to begin a systematic review of Harrison's sentencing patterns, looking for statistical anomalies that might indicate bias based on defendants' ability to pay for high-quality legal representation. What they found was disturbing, but not surprising. Over the past 5 years, defendants represented by expensive law firms had received significantly lighter sentences than those represented by public defenders or court-appointed attorneys. The disparity was most pronounced in cases involving financial crimes, where wealthy defendants typically received probation or short sentences while working-class defendants received lengthy prison terms for similar offenses. "This isn't just about Webb Construction," David reported to Maria after completing his analysis. "The corruption went deeper than we initially realized. Harrison wasn't just being influenced by direct payments. He was systematically favoring defendants who could afford to hire the kind of attorneys who could implicitly offer him future business opportunities." Maria felt a cold fury building as she reviewed David's findings. The scope of the injustice was staggering. Hundreds of people had been sentenced to longer prison terms, assessed higher fines, or ruled against in civil cases not because of the merits of their cases, but because of their economic status. "We need to establish a review panel immediately," Maria decided. "Every case Harrison presided over needs to be examined for potential bias. And we need to create a mechanism for people who believe they were treated unfairly to petition for review." The administrative challenge was enormous, but Maria was determined that the exposure of corruption would lead to meaningful reform rather than just punishment for the guilty parties. She began working with legal aid organizations, civil rights groups, and criminal justice reform advocates to create a comprehensive review process. Thomas Rivera became an invaluable ally in this effort. His 15 years of experience advocating for judicial reform and his deep understanding of how corruption affected ordinary Families made him an effective bridge between Maria's office and the communities that had been most harmed by the tainted system. "You know," Thomas told Maria during one of their planning meetings, "your father would be amazed by what you've accomplished. He always believed that the arc of justice was long, but that it bent toward righteousness. He just didn't live to see how right he was." The investigation into Judge Harrison's finances revealed additional disturbing details. The payments from Webb Construction were just the most obvious manifestation of a broader pattern of financial relationships with parties who appeared before his court. Harrison had accepted speaking fees from industry groups, consulting payments from law firms, and investment opportunities from businesses that were involved in litigation in his district. Marcus Webb, faced with overwhelming evidence of his participation in bribing a federal judge, agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the casual way in which the corruption had operated, with monthly payments disguised as consulting fees and judicial decisions that favored Webb Construction treated as routine business arrangements. Judge Harrison never explicitly promised specific rulings, Webb told investigators, but it was understood that our business relationship would be mutually beneficial. When cases came up involving our company, I expected favorable treatment, and I generally received it. The matter-of-fact way in which Webb described the corruption was perhaps more damning than any dramatic confession could have been. It revealed a system where judicial integrity had been so thoroughly compromised that bribery had become normalized, just another cost of doing business. Jennifer Parks, Webb's attorney, faced her own ethical investigation for her failure to advise her client to disclose the financial relationship with Judge Harrison. While she maintained that she had been unaware of the payments, her law firm's reputation was severely damaged by the association with the scandal. Judge Harrison himself remained largely silent during the initial phases of the investigation, communicating only through his attorney and declining requests for interviews. But the evidence against him was so overwhelming that his guilt was never seriously in doubt. The real question became not whether Harrison would be convicted, but what the broader implications of his corruption would be for the judicial system as a whole. 3 months after Maria's courtroom revelation, a special federal grand jury issued indictments against Judge Harrison for accepting bribes, Marcus Webb for offering bribes, and several associates who had facilitated the corrupt relationship. The indictments sent shockwaves through the legal community and prompted calls for more systematic reforms to prevent similar corruption in the future. But the most significant development was the establishment of the Miguel Rivera Justice Review panel, named in honor of Thomas Rivera's son, and charged with examining all cases that had been tainted by judicial corruption. The panel, headed by retired federal judge Margaret Chen, and including representatives from legal aid organizations, civil rights groups, and the defense bar, had the authority to recommend new trials, sentence reductions, or other remedies for people who had been victimized by corrupt judicial decisions. Maria was appointed as the special prosecutor charged with overseeing the ongoing investigation into judicial corruption throughout the district. It was a role that would define the rest of her career and establish her as a national leader in the fight for judicial integrity. Elena Vasquez was among the first people to benefit from the review panel's work. Her husband's case was identified as one where Judge Harrison's sentencing had been unusually harsh compared to similar cases, and the panel recommended that his sentence be reduced to time served. After 4 years in prison for a non-violent offense, he was finally able to return home to his family. "Ms. Santos saved my family," Elena told reporters after her husband's release. "She had the courage to stand up to powerful people who thought they were above the law. Because of her, my children have their father back." The ripple effects of Maria's courageous stand extended far beyond Chicago. Legal scholars began studying the case as an example of how systemic corruption could be exposed and addressed. Law schools added courses on prosecutorial ethics and the importance of challenging judicial misconduct. Bar associations strengthened their continuing education requirements for attorneys who appeared before federal courts. Thomas Rivera found himself in demand as a speaker at legal conferences and judicial reform gatherings. His story of loss and perseverance, combined with his first-hand knowledge of how corruption affected ordinary families, made him a powerful advocate for systemic change. "My son didn't die in vain," Thomas would tell audiences. His case and the work that Carlos Santos did to fight for him, and the courage that Maria Santos showed in exposing the truth, all of that is part of a larger story about how justice eventually prevails. It takes time, sometimes generations, but if people of goodwill keep fighting, justice will win. Judge Harrison ultimately pleaded guilty to accepting bribes and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Marcus Webb received a similar sentence for his role in the corruption scheme. But the real victory wasn't in their punishment. It was in the systematic reforms that their exposure had made possible. A year after Maria's courtroom revelation, she was invited to speak at the annual meeting of the American Bar Association. Standing before an audience of thousands of attorneys, judges, and legal scholars, she reflected on the lessons learned from the fight against judicial corruption. "The law is only as strong as the people who enforce it," Maria told the gathering. "When we allow corruption to flourish because it's easier than fighting it, when we turn away from injustice because challenging it might be uncomfortable, we become complicit in the very system we're supposed to be reforming." She paused, thinking of her father and the unsuccessful fight he had waged for Miguel Rivera, of Thomas Rivera and his 15-year quest for justice, of Elena Vasquez and all the other families who had suffered because of systemic corruption. But when people of conscience decide to stand up, when they're willing to risk their careers and their comfort for the sake of justice, that's when the system works the way it's supposed to. That's when we remember why we became lawyers in the first place. The audience gave Maria a standing ovation, but she was thinking not of the recognition she was receiving, but of the work that still lay ahead. Corruption was not unique to Chicago or to Judge Harrison. Similar problems existed in courtrooms across the country, and addressing them would require the kind of sustained effort and moral courage that her father had taught her to value above personal success. After her speech, Maria was approached by a young prosecutor from Atlanta who had been following her case closely. "Ms. Santos," the young woman said, "I think I may have uncovered something similar in my district. Would you be willing to share what you learned about investigating judicial corruption?" Maria smiled, recognizing in the young prosecutor the same determination and moral clarity that had driven her own investigation. "Of course. And remember, you're not just fighting for the defendants in the cases you're handling now. You're fighting for everyone who will come after them, everyone who deserves to have their case heard by a judge who can't be bought." The conversation reminded Maria that the fight for judicial integrity was not a one-time battle, but an ongoing responsibility that each generation of legal professionals would need to embrace. The corruption she had exposed in Chicago was just one manifestation of a broader challenge facing the American justice system. But she had also learned that individual courage could make an enormous difference. Her decision to risk her career, to expose Judge Harrison's corruption, had not only brought justice to specific victims, but had also inspired reforms that would protect countless future litigants. As Maria returned to Chicago and her ongoing work as a special prosecutor, she carried with her a deep sense of satisfaction. She had honored her father's legacy, brought justice to Miguel Rivera's memory, and given Thomas Rivera the vindication he had sought for 15 years. More importantly, she had demonstrated that the system could still work when people were willing to make it work. Corruption thrived in darkness and silence, but it could not survive the bright light of truth and the determined efforts of those who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The Carlos Santos Foundation for Judicial Integrity, established with funding from civil liberties organizations and legal reform groups, continued the work that Maria had begun. The foundation provided resources for attorneys who wanted to challenge judicial misconduct, supported families who had been victimized by corrupt judges, and advocated for systemic reforms to prevent future corruption. Thomas Rivera served on the Foundation's Board of Directors, bringing his decades of experience as a judicial watchdog to the organization's oversight and advocacy efforts. In many ways, the Foundation represented the completion of a circle that had begun with his son's wrongful conviction and his first meeting with Carlos Santos. Carlos told me once that sometimes the most important cases are the ones you lose, Thomas reflected during a Foundation meeting. He said that even when you can't win justice for your client, you can still plant seeds that will grow into justice for someone else's client. What Maria accomplished proves he was right. Elena Vasquez also became involved with the Foundation, sharing her story with other families who had been affected by judicial corruption and helping them navigate the complex process of seeking redress through the review panel system. Before Ms. Santos stood up in that courtroom, Elena would tell these families, I felt completely powerless. I knew something was wrong with my husband's case, but I didn't know how to fight it. Now I know that the system can work if good people are willing to make it work. The long-term impact of Maria's courtroom revelation extended beyond the specific cases and individuals directly affected by Judge Harrison's corruption. Legal educators began incorporating the Chicago case into their curricula as an example of prosecutorial courage and ethical responsibility. Judicial training programs added sessions on financial disclosure requirements and the importance of avoiding conflicts of interest. Perhaps most importantly, the case became a symbol of the possibility for positive change within the justice system. In an era when many Americans had lost faith in their institutions, Maria's successful challenge to judicial corruption demonstrated that individual action could still make a difference. 5 years after that dramatic day in Courtroom 7B, Maria Santos was appointed to serve as a federal judge herself. The appointment was seen as a powerful statement about the importance of judicial integrity and the value of moral courage in the legal profession. During her confirmation hearings, Maria was asked about the lessons she had learned from her fight against judicial corruption. I learned that the law is not a perfect system, she testified, but it can be a just system if the people who work within it are committed to justice rather than personal gain. I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right, despite the fear. And I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to stand up and speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's risky, even when you're not sure anyone is listening. Thomas Rivera, now in his 80s but still actively involved in judicial reform efforts, attended Maria's confirmation hearings. Watching her take the oath of office as a federal judge, he felt a deep sense of peace that had eluded him for decades. Miguel, he whispered to his sons, "Remember, justice finally came. It took longer than we hoped, but it came." The courtroom where Judge Harrison had once presided over tainted proceedings was renamed the Miguel Rivera Federal Courtroom, a permanent reminder of the human cost of judicial corruption and the importance of fighting for justice even when the odds seem insurmountable. On the wall of the courtroom hung a simple plaque with words that Carlos Santos had often quoted to his daughter. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice fought for, even in defeat, is justice that will eventually prevail. Maria Santos, now Judge Santos, would carry those words with her as she began her own judicial career, determined to honor the legacy of courage and integrity that had brought her to this moment. The fight against corruption would continue, led by a new generation of legal professionals who had been inspired by her example to put justice above personal comfort and moral courage above career advancement. The story that had begun with one prosecutor's decision to challenge a corrupt judge had become something much larger, a reminder that individual action could still change systems, that moral courage was still possible in a complex world, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved by those willing to fight for it. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that in a world where cynicism and resignation often seemed easier than hope and action, there were still people willing to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. And sometimes that was all it took to change everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.